Hi everyone, welcome to this session. We're going to get started in just a minute here. We're going to talk about background tasks without a separate service, specifically for ASP.NET and .NET more generally. So here's a question on Stack Overflow about threading, and this is about threading, but I think it's relevant when it comes to background processing because there's some overlap there. And we just celebrated about the 10th or 11th year anniversary of this answer, this accepted answer on Stack Overflow. This is a sarcastic answer. It's not a very helpful answer, but it's accepted. I think I can make this criticism because I was the one who actually answered this on Stack Overflow back in, you can see there, 2009. And I was going through some things at the time with threading. So I was very frustrated with threading, all the race conditions, making it difficult to write unit tests and so on. And so this is the answer I gave back then to thread. And I feel like background processing is a very similar thing. It's not going to make anything easier. But there are some approaches we can take that will reduce the amount of difficulty that we face. So today's agenda I'm going to talk about background tasks and what are some tools that have been used for background tasks that might be causing you problems, that other people might be using for background processing. And then I'm going to introduce you to a tool called Hangfire, which I think is a really great tool to get started in a simple way with background processing. And then once I introduce you to it, I'm going to show you a quick demo of it. I've got a demo app of a personal project that I'm working on. I'm going to walk you through some of the Hangfire parts of it. And then after the demo, I'm going to talk about some of the gotchas, some of the tips, some of the things you need to think about when using Hangfire that you might not be aware of when you first start out. And then I'll wrap up with a quick summary and some other resources you can go to explore to learn more about Hangfire. So who am I and where am I? These are questions I often ask myself, so I put some slides in to remind me. I'm Matthew Groves. I'm a developer advocate here at Couchbase. I'm Microsoft MVP, Pluralsight author. Importantly, I'm responsible for two great kids. I'm a husband as well. And this is important because later on in the demo, this kind of fits into the whole story of being, a family man with two kids and all the photographs that go along with that. I'm here at Couchbase Connect 2020, so if you're watching or reading this elsewhere or later on, definitely want to go to connect.couchbase.com and check it out. See when the next Connect's coming up. Check out all the other Connect content on there. It'll be great. This is an old picture, a pretty old picture when I was much younger, and I used to leave the house and wear suits and such. And this is what I look like in 2020 because, it's been a rough year for everybody. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started now with background tasks. We'll start with background processing. So we can't talk about background processing and scheduled tasks, scheduled jobs without mentioning cron. This is a time-based job scheduling tool. So cron itself is a Unix command. In Windows, the equivalent is like a scheduled task. Cloud providers have similar tools like Azure Scheduler, AWS Scheduled Tasks, and so on. Now, cron itself is a specific tool with a specific syntax, but often people will say cron job as shorthand for executing some sort of process on a scheduled basis. Now, cron is tried and true. It stands the test of time, and possibly, and I don't say this lightly, possibly one of the best pieces of software ever created. So I can't possibly say that you shouldn't use cron or some sort of scheduling tool. But the issue with using cron for background processing is that it's typically going to require a separate process to be created and deployed, which can complicate your deployment. So you could just have cron hit an endpoint, HTTP endpoint, in your ASP.NET application, but now you're going to introduce HTTP into it, you're going to tie up that HTTP pipeline, and even a really simple cron script like cron curl it's still a separate thing that you have to remember to update and deploy, and it's separate from your ASP.NET app. And also with cron, it's a great tool, but it is just doing one thing really, really well. It's just a scheduler. It doesn't have any state, so it can't do something like a fire and forget, continuation, retries, etc. So cron is a great tool, but it's lacking all those other capabilities. So other approaches include using all these various tools here I'm showing on the screen. So something like a message broker, a queuing system, a service bus, the actor model, a pub sub, etc. And these are tools that are meant to either pass messages around between processes or distribute work amongst multiple nodes and worker processes. Now, once again, these are all fine pieces of software being used to great effect. These tools all have state, so they're able to do things like retries. They support various models of scaling. There's a lot of monitoring tools and ecosystems around these, and these are all fine tools. I can't tell you shouldn't use them either. And I have myself experience with most of the tools here on the screen, not all of them, but most of them. And they're all relatively heavy solutions. So Rabbit and Kafka, for instance, require deployments of their own. You have to instantiate a Rabbit MQ server or a Kafka server or multiple servers. You may have to implement specific interfaces, base classes in your code. You have to match specific APIs. It requires some sort of coupling between this tool and your code. And again, for good reason, because these are often meant to support complex scenarios, multiple state background processing, long-running multi-step processes, broadcasting, etc. So they're really heavy tools that have a wide variety of different ways you can use them. So thinking about cron and thinking about all these tools, there are some drawbacks and trade-offs. So for one, most all of them, even the simplest version, requires a separate deployment. You have to deploy some other process besides your website. With cron, it's a very simple, straightforward, single-purpose but limited tool. With the non-cron solutions, that previous slide, they can all be complex. They can have some heavy setup, additional deployment with them, and then some of them may require some changes to your code. So one or more of these drawbacks or trade-offs, depending on how you think about them, are part of using those tools there. So I want to introduce another tool called Hangfire that kind of presents some middle ground to these approaches. So this is just the elevator pitch for Hangfire from the Hangfire website, and I think it really addresses the drawbacks of those other methods and carves out its own niche in background processing. So it's easy to get started for simple tasks, and if you need the more complex stuff that the more stateful tools provide, you can easily scale Hangfire as well. So here's a diagram of the basics of how Hangfire works. So you have a Hangfire client, which is responsible for creating the jobs. Those jobs get stored in some database. In our case, we're going to use Couchbase. And then the Hangfire server is going to fetch tasks from the database, from job storage, and perform those tasks in the background. Now, the key point here is that the Hangfire client and the Hangfire server can both run in the same application, the same ASP.NET program. They don't have to, but they can. Now, the way that Hangfire scales, I mentioned briefly scale, it's going to look very familiar to you. So it's similar to how you'd scale session storage or cache, distributed cache with ASP.NET. So this is like a load balancer in front of a series of ASP.NET servers, and each of them can run Hangfire, and the data is going to be stored on the Hangfire data store, so in our case, again, Couchbase. And then it can be each of those ASP.NET servers can retrieve jobs from Hangfire data storage and run them. Now, if you want to scale your ASP.NET application, Hangfire is just going to scale with it. Again, if you want to take that approach. You can also deploy standalone Hangfire servers individually. So Hangfire is not coupled to ASP.NET. It can run in a console app or a Windows service, something like that. Now, for job storage, Hangfire supports a lot of databases, but there is a Couchbase extension available for that. And I think that this is a great fit for Hangfire because Couchbase obviously has the memory-first architecture for really fast retrieval, and it can also scale horizontally. So for massive job processing, it's a perfect fit. You can scale up Couchbase, you can scale up Hangfire, you can scale up ASP.NET. All those things, you can scale them up very easily. Scale them out, I should say. And by the way, Couchbase can handle session storage and caching and user profile. So for ASP.NET, I think of Couchbase as kind of an all-purpose utility database. So it can be the primary data store, certainly, but it can also do all those other things I mentioned. And so even if you are stuck with like a SQL Server legacy database or Oracle database, something like that, Couchbase can still help here and just be a utility player for your software. This is the really killer thing for me about Hangfire that I really liked when I first saw this, and I said, yep, I got to try this out. So Hangfire, it ships with a built-in UI. You don't have to build this yourself. It all comes with Hangfire. So you get a dashboard to show a graph of your job history. You can get a list of all the recurring jobs. You can of course, view the detailed job history. You can actually start jobs manually if you need to or if you want to for testing purposes. And just like with Couchbase Server, you can get a list of all the Hangfire servers that are currently connected to the persistent store, to the job storage. So it's all there in the dashboard. So I want to show you now some different types of tasks that you can actually run in Hangfire, some code. This is just right from the Hangfire documentation of how you actually create background tasks. Because this is really, I think, where it shines as well. This UI is nice and the scaling is nice, but the actual code part is very straightforward and very simple to get started with. So you don't have to do a lot of extra coding just to make it work with a particular tool. So the first type I want to cover here, the first task type is called Fire and Forget. And this is a task that's going to run immediately and it's going to run only once. So for instance, some background process that sends an email or executes something against a slow third-party API, something that you don't want to block for or something that you don't need to block for. So notice how you use Hangfire here. So background job, that's a Hangfire class, .enqueue, and what you supply to it is a C# expression. It's not something that implements an iJob interface or has a base class or something like that. It's just any sort of C# you want to throw in there. Now, don't take that as a challenge. But I should say that any C# I've given to Hangfire so far, when I've used it, has worked just fine. Hangfire's had no problem understanding any sort of C# in there. We'll talk about that later, about some good ideas and some tips around what kind of C# expression to put in there. So one thing I want to point out now is that it also returns a job ID. So notice that this enqueue method returns a job ID. And that's important because of the second task type, which is a continuation. So these will execute after a given job has finished. So that's why we need the job ID to tell it, okay, after that job ID, go ahead and do something else. So let's think about like the typical Amazon purchase use case, right? So the first job might be to verify inventory. Do we have the item that they purchased? The next job would be payment processing. Okay, let's take the money from their credit card. The next job would be shipping. Okay, let's actually get it picked out of the warehouse and put a label on it. The next job would be email notification, etc. So it makes sense to execute these all in the background, but it doesn't make sense to execute them all at the same time. So we have a continuation to do step 1, then step 2, then step 3, and so on. The third type, and this is the one I mainly use Hangfire for, as you'll see in the demo, is a recurring task. So recurring jobs fire many times on, hey, you guessed it, our old friend, a cron schedule. So let's say you want to run some code every night. So in my example here, you're going to see me update a cache record every minute. I'm going to process some Azure Cognitive Services every couple of hours. And again, this is just recurring job.adder_update. So you could run that on startup usually. Supply a C# expression to it, like I mentioned here, and then you supply a cron expression. So it's literally the same cron syntax. There are some convenience methods here like cron.daily, but it's just a string. So if you already know how to create a cron string, you can use the same exact syntax that you've learned and use it here with Hangfire, which I think is really great. There's no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to cron syntax. There are other types of tasks in Hangfire. I'm not going to cover them too much. So there's a delayed job, which means, okay, 7 days from now, send an email, for instance, a reminder email. And there are some features in Hangfire Pro, which I've not used the Hangfire Pro version yet, but batches. So a group of background tasks that are atomically created. They're considered a single entity. And then, of course, batch continuations, which are just like continuations, but after a batch. And so these are available in the Hangfire Pro, which is the paid version. That's the most I'm going to mention here. I'll mention it a little towards the end as well, but I'm not going to show you any of that code in action. Okay, so let's see some code in action now. I'm going to show you a demo here. And this is a fairly complex application that I'm working on. But there's just a few parts of it that use Hangfire right now, so I want to focus on those. But I want to describe the application here quickly. So it's something I've called Best Pictures so far, for lack of a better name. And this is all about my family photo metadata. Remember I mentioned I had 2 kids and a wife? So what that means, of course, in this day and age is that I have 20,000 plus pictures, digital pictures of my family and growing. Family and extended family and all kinds of things. So many pictures. Way more than my parents or my grandparents ever had of pictures. So I just store them in a big mishmash of folders and files, and I back them up to OneDrive. So I have a copy of them locally on my hard drive here, but they also get backed up to the cloud because I don't want to lose them in case something happens to my computer. So that's great. That's fine. I have them all backed up. The problem is when my wife asks me, "Hey, honey, would you find that one picture of Emma, my daughter? Would you just find that one picture for me?" And okay, I have to sort through 20,000 plus pictures to find, Emma wore a costume on last Halloween. We want to get that picture out. Oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? So I just devised a system here, and it's not perfect yet. I'm still working on it. But for each picture, I want to collect a record of each picture, so a document in Couchbase of each picture. It corresponds to each file. And then I want to put into that documentation some metadata, that document, some metadata. So who's in that picture and how good of a picture is it? So I want to rank them as well, because there's a lot of sort of low resolution, blurry pictures, things like that. It may be a good picture of Emma, but not a good picture of my son, Matt, or vice versa. So how do I rank those pictures? And I've got other problems as well. So duplicate files, because I make mistakes. Sometimes I back up the pictures on my wife's phone, and later on I forget to delete them, and then I back them up again. So now I have duplicate files. I mentioned blurry photos as well, and we have a ton of photos backed up that we really don't need to keep. So, screenshots or funny GIFs, things like that. We don't need to keep those backed up on OneDrive, so we can get rid of those. So those are the problems I'm trying to tackle here. But I wanted to use some background processing for this for a few reasons. So I'm going to show you in the demo some basic setup and configuration of Hangfire. And then I have 4 recurring jobs. I think 4. Maybe I have more by now. But 4 recurring jobs of Hangfire. So one of them is going to just monitor the file system and look for any new pictures that have hit the file system on OneDrive. And so I'm just going to grab those and scoop them up and then create a record for them in my database in Couchbase. And then I want to cache my progress data. So as I go through this system, there is a manual component to it where I go through and rank the pictures and say who's in them and so on. I want to update on a regular basis, what's my progress? So how many pictures have I cataloged? Am I at 25% yet? Am I at 45% yet? And so on. So I have some progress data that I want to cache, but that's expensive to compute. Every time I refresh the page, for instance, I don't want to go through that computation. So instead, I have a process that runs in the background on a regular basis, I think every minute or so, that will repopulate my progress data and sort of cache it into a single document. And then I also have some processes that will use Azure Cognitive Services, so some machine learning type of things that will use Azure to get information about the photo and to get information about the faces in the photo. So it's some machine learning that can identify faces and say, well, this is a face of an 8-year-old boy, and this is a face of a 10-year-old girl. And that can help me figure out, okay, well, if it's a 10-year-old girl, it's probably my daughter in there. Or if it's a 40-year-old man, that's probably me in the picture. So I can use that to kind of help me guess a little bit. And then I also want to show you, of course, the Hangfire dashboard, because it's just so amazing and so easy to get up and running. So that's what I'm going to switch to now. I'm going to switch over to the demo, and we'll get started there. Here is my Best Pictures app. Now what this does is it picks 2 pictures at random from my whole collection and asks me to rank them. Now this goes into a slightly modified ELO ranking algorithm, which is used in many sports and board games, and I'm experimenting with using it on family pictures. This will help me identify both who is in the picture and which are the best pictures of that person. Now it's still mostly a manual process, but it's down to 1 click, left, right, or none. And as you'll see later, I can actually augment that with machine learning to help me guess and help me find pictures and categorize them better. So anyway, that's just some background information. I want to focus on the parts of this app that use Hangfire for background tasks. Now at the bottom here is some ranking information that helps me see progress. Because this is a process that requires some manual interaction, it's good for me to see that I'm making progress, so it encourages me to keep going. Now the first column here is actually the number of people, is actually a number of people, so a maximum of 4, a minimum of 0, and that's the size of my family, is 4. The second column is how many pictures have been categorized so far that have that many people in them. So as I go forward, I would expect the first row to also go to 0 eventually, and the other numbers start to increase. This is actually expensive to calculate since I have to query the entire database. Adding that to every page refresh would add in a couple seconds, and that's just going to make the manual process even slower. So what I've done instead is that this data is actually being pulled from a single document in Couchbase. It's a cached result of a query, and that query is being run by a background process and saved to that cached document. So next, I want to open up the Hangfire dashboard. The home page of the dashboard shows a real-time graph of jobs running. Green means successful. And it also shows an historical chart here showing jobs that have run today or this week. I'm just going to fast forward the video a bit here so you get the idea. All right, next is I can click Jobs here at the top to see a list of various jobs that have succeeded or failed, etc. I can also click Recurring Jobs to see a list of all the recurring jobs that I've defined. Now I've got 4 jobs here. I'll show you later how I define those. And you can see the cron expression for each one of those. You can see when they're going to execute next, and so on. Also notice each one has a checkbox. I can check a box and click Trigger Now to execute the job on an ad hoc basis. So I'm going to select the 2 Azure Cognitive Services jobs. This is the machine learning I was talking about. These are going to send a bunch of images to Azure's machine learning services to first analyze the photos and just to try to determine what's in the photos. And second, assume that there are faces in there and try to analyze and find those faces in the photos. Using background tasks for Azure machine learning is great for background processing because these things take time. It takes time to upload photos to Azure. These can be very large photos, and it takes time for Azure to actually process those. Second reason is I'm using the free tier of Azure, so I'm limited to how many pictures I can send per month. By using a background process on a cron schedule, I won't exceed that limit. So I'm going to go ahead and trigger those now and send a batch of photos to Azure. So I'll go back to the Jobs tab and click Processing. I can watch these jobs run and see when they finish, assuming they finish successfully, and they will. So after these finish, I'm going to go over to Couchbase now to see what was actually stored. So I'm going to look at one example here. Now this document represents the metadata of an image. And I'm not going to store the image in Couchbase, just the metadata. So inside of here, there's a number of properties. File is information about the file, so it's date, the file name, and path. Checksum, which is good for finding duplicates. The next one here is ranking. This is where I put the ELO scores. And eventually, after going through the ranking process enough and gradually over time, this is going to contain useful ELO scores that tell me who's in the photo, because they're going to have a high score, and how good of a photo is it, and compared to other photos. So again, the higher score, the better the photo. Okay, the next one is photo and face. This is the data that comes from Azure. Photo contains information about a photo in general. It could be a photo of anything. Azure is going to try to analyze it. And Azure creates a caption and some tags that can help in searching and categorization. So again, back to my use case, my wife asking me, could you find that picture of Matthew? He was eating yogurt somewhere. And this information would be useful in a full text search query, for instance. So you may want to check out some of the other Connect sessions about full text search. Okay, then let's look at the face data. So this is going to contain Azure's guess about the faces in the photo, if it can find any. It doesn't always find them, even if they're there. In this case, it just found the one face, and it's guessing that it's male, that it's showing an expression of happiness on the face, that it's not wearing glasses, and that the face it represents a person who is of age 7. So putting that all together, this is information that can help me guess that it's my son, because I know the date of the image, I know my son's birth date, so I can do the math there and say, yeah, it was probably around when he was age 7. But then I had to put in a tolerance there because Azure's machine learning is not always exactly right. And so here's a picture. That's a pretty good guess in this case. I don't remember if he's 7 in this picture, but it looks about right. So we have one more background task left that I want to go over, which is the task that looks for new files. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to count all the documents in the Family Photos bucket. I'm going to do that here in Couchbase with a select query. So I see that there's 12 photos there, or 12 documents in that bucket. Now let's go to my desktop. I'm going to move 2 more pictures into the folder that I configured the Best Pictures app to use. So obviously I have more than 12 photos. I have 20,000, 25,000 photos right now. But just for demonstration, I'm keeping it small to a small amount here. So I'm going to drag and drop those images into the folder. Now let's go back to the Hangfire dashboard and go back to the jobs here, and I'll select Photo Processor, and I'll just trigger that right now. Now note that this triggers automatically every hour, but for this demo we really can't wait that long, so I'm just going ahead and triggering it manually. Now let's go back to that select statement and run that query again, and as we'd expect, there's now 14 documents. So that background task was run, it looked at the file system, found 2 new documents, and there we go. Now let's look at the code. Let's look at the code that configures Hangfire and makes all this stuff possible. So I'm going to focus on just one file here. There's lots of files in this project, but we're going to look at just startup.cs. This is an ASP.NET Core project, but of course Hangfire can work with ASP.NET as well. So let's scroll down here to the Hangfire setup section. There's really only one line here to set up this ASP.NET Core project to use Hangfire, and that's services.add-hangfire, which I then configured to use Couchbase storage by giving it a client configuration and bucket name. And that's all there is to it. Now I can start feeding jobs into Hangfire. Easy as that. Let's scroll down more to the configure method here. This is the background job section. So first, I'm saying app use Hangfire dashboard. And that's all you need to write to get that great Hangfire UI dashboard that I've been showing. I'm also specifying authorization level for the dashboard, and more on that later. Second, I'm saying use Hangfire server. So now this ASP.NET application, when it's running, is going to start processing those Hangfire jobs in the background. Now, the next part here, you do not have to define the background jobs here in Startup. They can be defined anywhere you want them to. But I know that Startup's always going to run, so I put them here. So the first one is the job here to actually look for photos on the file system, look for new images in the folder that I specified. And all I'm doing there is just giving it a name, saying recurring job, add or update, giving it a name, just a convenient name for me to know. I'm specifying a type. That's the kind of type that's going to be injected thanks to ASP.NET's dependency injection. And I'm just calling the process all method on that type. And you can see there I'm specifying cron.hourly. That's literally a string that says run this every hour. The next one down here is very similar. I'm calling this cache score document. This is what's going to run every minute to create that cache document that has the score. So as I click through, I'll eventually, every minute or so, get an update to that score. So I can see that I'm making progress. And the last two here are the ones that are going to communicate to Azure in the background. So the first one is the photo data one, and the second one is the face data one. And I'm running those every day. So those are cron.daily. And that's really it. That's all I've done to use Hangfire in my ASP.NET Core application. I don't need to show you all the code that's actually being run behind the scenes, because that's not really something specific to Hangfire. It's just I can feed in whatever code I want to. I don't have to implement a iJob interface or a base class or anything like that. I can just put in a C# expression and away we go. So that's it for the demo. Let's head on back to the slides and we'll finish up. Okay, so let's just wrap up here. We've seen a demo in action, but just like with any tool, there's always some trade-offs and there's always some gotchas. And so I've compiled a list of tips and gotchas that you need to think about when using Hangfire, and some of the workarounds and rules of thumb that you can use to have better success. So the first one is with exceptions. Exceptions can happen in background tasks too. Now, what Hangfire will do was actually log these exceptions, and then if the exception happens, it will retry up to 10 times by default with an increasing delay. Now, what happens is you can actually view some of the exception information, so some of the stack trace. You can choose to re-queue the job manually if you want to. And I mentioned the retry up to 10 times. You can configure that to not retry, to retry a different number of times, and you can specify that per task, or you can specify it globally. Something to think about with deployment is ASP.NET applications, depending on how you deploy them, may not start until the first user hits your website. So Hangfire may not start right away either. And the processes, ASP.NET processes, may be recycled after a period of inactivity. If you've deployed ASP.NET before, you're probably familiar with this. But if you have Hangfire in there, then that's going to have an additional sort of challenge. So for an on-premises site, you'll need to do some additional configuration to keep that process running. And Hangfire has some documentation about this. For ASP.NET Core, if you run your jobs in startup, they should start right away. If you're deploying to Azure, there is a switch there on the Azure portal that says always on. And that's not available for free sites. So if you want your Hangfire job to run in just ASP.NET, then you can't really do that with a free site. It's going to eventually fall to sleep. So you can always fall back to, go back to the separate processes, which was kind of what we were trying to avoid to begin with. But if as your site's starting to grow and needs to scale out anyway, you're probably going to graduate beyond that free tier of Azure as well. And of course, you can always fall back to having a cron job just ping your site every once in a while to keep it awake, which again kind of defeats the purpose of the not having separate deployments. But again, as you grow, you might need to do something like that. So I mentioned this in the code here, the dashboard security. By default, only localhost can access that Hangfire dashboard. So that's a security feature built in. Now, once you deploy to production, that's probably not going to work. So you're going to need to specify a authorization filter. So here's an example here of a filter that looks at the HTTP context user identity and just goes off of that. Now you can add more complex logic in here if you want to. In my code sample that I showed you, I just had it always return true, which is not a good practice. But you're going to need to create an authorization filter if you want to allow access to the dashboard beyond localhost. Another thing to think about is when Hangfire stores jobs in persistence in Couchbase in our case, the jobs get serialized during the creation process and they get serialized to JSON. And the arguments get serialized to JSON along with them. So if you have complex identities that you're passing into those methods, it's better to put that data somewhere else, maybe in a database or someplace else you can access it, and just pass in the ID. So in this case, on the top, we'd have to serialize the entire entity object into JSON. For a large amount of jobs, that could be very problematic. The lower example there, we're just serializing an integer into JSON, which is very, very small. And then inside the job, we can then go and fetch the full entity using the entity ID if we need to. But in this case, we avoid serializing a huge entity, a huge complex entity into JSON, into our Hangfire job storage. And some of the drawbacks, trade-offs to think about when considering Hangfire is that, number one, it's .NET only, .NET and .NET Core. So this may not be the best enterprise-wide solution unless you're entirely .NET across your enterprise. So that's one drawback you have to think about. Persistence is required. So this is one of the good things I think about Hangfire, but it's definitely a trade-off that not every background task necessarily needs persistence, right? So there's lots of plugins for all different types of persistence. You definitely do need it, but you do get some benefits with it. The third thing is that the default deployment inside .NET, which we just talked about, has some disadvantages and workarounds when it comes to keeping it alive, so you got to think about that. And of course, the premium features cost extra. For some reason, the developer behind Hangfire wants to get paid, but it's a very reasonable price for that license. It's not a huge burden at all. So they say you only remember about 3 or 4 things from any given presentation, so here they are. Hangfire makes it easy like a Sunday morning. So it's easy to get running with some rich background tasks right away. No separate deployment, no base class, just start writing Hangfire code in your ASP.NET project and away you go. Hangfire can scale big. It's easy to scale horizontally, just like Couchbase. Add additional nodes, point them to the persistence, to Couchbase in our case. So as you scale ASP.NET, as you scale Couchbase, you can just as easily scale Hangfire. You can scale it within ASP.NET or with separate servers or a combination of both, whatever you'd like to do. Hangfire comes with a UI. This is a killer feature. Now I know as developers we're supposed to love the command line and memorize all those arcane commands and flags and whatnot, but personally I like a powerful UI, and this is something that is just built right in. You don't have to build it yourself. You don't have to do anything other than just one line of code, and you get this really nice UI out of the box. Some more resources for you to explore. So if you're new to cron syntax, it's everywhere. You can find information on it everywhere on the web. But here's one tutorial that I found pretty good about the cron syntax. You can check that out. The second link here is for Mass Transit and Top Shelf. So Top Shelf is a service hosting framework for .NET. So if you find yourself having to deploy multiple processes anyway, make it easier on yourself and use something like Top Shelf. And then, of course, Mass Transit is kind of a sister project of Top Shelf that does some of the same things that Hangfire can do with background processing and service bus and so on. Finally, this blog post from Scott Hensman, this was way back in 2014, but it's a very good rundown of background tasks in ASP.NET, and Hangfire is on that list. So it's been around for a while. It's been tried and tested and used in production by lots of people. You can see here's a list of customers from the Hangfire website you can check out. Some more Hangfire resources, so hangfire.io. This is really stellar documentation there, just really well done. I really like it. Hangfire IO is on GitHub, of course. There's a ton of Hangfire extensions. So chances are, oh, by the way, this is a reminder, this is a pre-recorded session, but I am on hand in the chat right now. If you're at the Connect 2020 premiere, I am on hand to answer your questions. But chances are, any questions you have, can Hangfire do this, can Hangfire do that? The answer is probably yes, there's an extension for it. So hangfire.io/extensions, check out all the extra things you can do with those extensions. The third one is the Hangfire Couchbase project, and this gives you the ability to use Hangfire with Couchbase. And that's an open source project. It could definitely use some attention and some help on that project there. Just want to go and check it out. It could use migrating to SDK 3, for instance, since that just was released. So if you're interested in Hangfire, there's a great project out there for it, but it could definitely use some more people to put their hands on it, try it out, use it, and try it in some projects. And the last one is pricing, so I thought I'd link to it anyway. Hangfire.io/pricing. The free version comes with lots of great functionality. The pro version comes with a few other features that you might want and dedicated support, and I think it's a pretty reasonable price for that. If anything looks interesting to you, you have questions or feedback, just go ahead and ask in the chat. This is a channel, but I'm actually live in the chat right now. So while you're typing, there's some questions that I've gotten before. Maybe I'll just go ahead and touch on those here. I get asked about how the background jobs work. So the background jobs in Hangfire, they are processed by a dedicated pool of worker threads that can run, that do run inside the Hangfire server subsystem. So you can specify the number of worker threads if you want to do that. Some people have asked about consuming extra thread pool threads with Hangfire. And so the good news there is that Hangfire has a separate and limited thread pool. So it's not going to affect any of the other thread stuff you're doing. If you're doing thread stuff in your application, Hangfire is not going to intrude on those. I often get questioned about the web farm, the web garden kind of layout, which I showed in some of the diagrams here. People are worried about synchronization issues, but it's not a problem because it's, as we've seen, it's web farm friendly by default because of the persistence layer. So every one of those nodes in your web farm can run background tasks if you want them to, but they're not going to have any problem synchronizing with each other because they're all looking at working out of the persistence in the database there. And finally, Hangfire can handle it can process multiple queues. So if you want to prioritize your jobs or split the processing among your servers, you can absolutely do that. Okay, so thank you very much for attending Connect this year. I appreciate it. And like I said, I'm in the chat right now, ready to answer questions. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.